Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Cindy DeWolf, and I'm going to be your moderator today, and I'm with the Division of Air Pollution Control here at Ohio EPA. This morning's webinar, Air Permitting for Major Sources Part 1, is part of Ohio EPA's 2020 Virtual Compliance Conference. These webinars will occur over a 3-week period from September 21st through October 8th. Please visit our conference webpage for more information about the sessions you may have missed or to register for the upcoming sessions. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items to help you participate in today's event. On this slide, you will see the screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop and in the upper right-hand corner. For this webinar, you are listening using your computer audio. If you are having sound issues, please check your computer's audio settings. You may want to try refreshing your browser or logging off the session and logging back in. Please feel free to submit questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the question pane of the control panel. You can send your questions at any time during the presentation. We have Tim Fisher, the APC manager from our Northeast District office, and Ben Halton, who is the lead permit specialist for Central District office, behind the scenes answering your questions. We will also collect these questions and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. If we do not have time to answer your questions, the presenters will reach out to you through email and assist you with your question. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the presentation is available in the handout section of your attendee interface. Once the webinar is edited, you will receive a link to the recording and a follow-up email, along with the session survey. The session survey will also appear once the session is over. We would greatly appreciate if you could fill that out to let us know how we are doing and to let us know if there's anything we can do to assist you in the future. A certificate of attendance will also be included in that email about a day or so after the session. We're happy to report that 1 hour of registered sanitarian and sanitarian in training continuing education units is approved for this session. If you did not enter your RS SIT number when registering for the session, please make sure you provide us with your number through the Q&A feature. Attendees seeking American Planning Association credit may do so through APA's self-reporting option. Log into My APA account and select the Self-Reported Credits option to receive credits. If you are seeking other CEUs, check out our e-binder attached to today's webinar. Now I'd like to introduce our presenters. Today's presenters are Bob Hodenbosey and Mike Hopkins from the Division of Air Pollution Control. Bob Hodenbosey became chief of the Division of Air Pollution Control, or DAPC, in 1992. As chief, he is responsible for Ohio's Air Pollution Control Program and development of the programs needed to comply with the Clean Air Act amendments. Prior to that, Bob held various positions in the Division of Air Pollution Control. Bob is a member of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers and the Air and Waste Management Association, and is registered as a professional engineer in the state of Ohio. Bob received his bachelor's and master's degrees in chemical engineering from Cleveland State University. In addition, he completed postgraduate courses in fluid mechanics and turbulence from The Ohio State University. Mike Hopkins has been with Ohio EPA since 1980. Since 2003, he has served as Assistant Chief for Permitting. His duties include the review and final approval of all air pollution permit to install and operate, and Title V permitting in the state, and general air pollution planning activities. Prior to becoming Assistant Chief, Mike oversaw the Air Quality Modeling and Planning section, and he was previously in our Central District office over the engineering section. Mike earned his bachelor's degree in environmental engineering from the Pennsylvania State University. He is a licensed professional engineer in the state of Ohio and also a member of the Air and Waste Management Association, the National Society of Professional Engineers, and the Ohio Society of Professional Engineers. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike and Bob.
Good morning, all. Today we are going to be talking about major news source review, and there's a number of items that we will be discussing this morning, and the purpose is for you to get an understanding of some of the terms that we have in terms of attainment, non-attainment, prevention of significant deterioration, and we'll be using the term PSD a lot and non-attainment news source review. Plus, at the end, there's additional material that we will not have time to cover, but you will get them as part of the package that's mailed out. So what is major news source permitting? This is a requirement that started under the Clean Air Act, and for any source that is a large source that's defined as a major, and we'll get into the definitions of what a major is, it needs to get a special permit, and that permit would either include prevention of significant deterioration or non-attainment news source review that applies in non-attainment areas. We have adopted state rules in Ohio so that we operate both the PSD program and the non-attainment news source review program for the state of Ohio. In some other states, US EPA issues these permits, but for us, we are able to issue for our industry both of those permits as part of our permit to install program. So first, some basics. What's an attainment area? What's a non-attainment area? An attainment area meets the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAICS. The non-attainment area does not. And although that seems real simple, we'll see there's always questions associated with it. An area can be attainment for some pollutants and non-attainment for others. So when looking at a new source permit, look at what the emissions are and whether it matches up with that pollutant. So if it's non-attainment for ozone and it's a major SO2 source and it's attainment, then it's just PSD. Right now, what is Ohio's attainment status? We are attainment in the entire state for particulate matter less than 2.5 microns, PM10, particulate matter less than 10 microns, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, and lead. We do have non-attainment areas for ozone and SO2. Our ozone non-attainment areas are shown in the map, and we started with the 2015 ozone standard. The three major urban areas in the state: Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati, based from the 2015 standard. We were able to have Columbus redesignated to attainment because we were able to show that we were meeting the air quality standard in the Columbus area. In the Cleveland and Cincinnati areas, we do not attain the standard yet, and we continue to measure exceedances and violations of the 2015 ozone standard. So the ozone standard itself has been more restrictive over time. US EPA has adopted more stringent ozone standards on a periodic basis. And the old ozone standard, 0.08 parts per million, that we met that everywhere, and we've been redesignated to attainment for that standard a number of years ago. For the 2008 standard, the 0.075 parts per million standard, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus have met that standard, and we were redesignated to attainment shortly before US EPA adopted in 2015 a now more stringent standard of 70 parts per billion. For SO2, we still do have we have one remaining non-attainment area. The other areas have been redesignated to attainment. Our one remaining non-attainment area that we are working on to get redesignated at this point, but it is not yet, is in the Muskingum River Power Plant area, Washington and Morgan counties, where the former Muskingum River plant existed. That caused a violation of the air quality standards. But even though that plant has been shut down a number of years, the area is still redesignated because there are some other sources in the area that emit SO2, and we have a pretty lengthy process involved to get an approvable SIP in that particular area. But once we get that behind us, we will be able to have that area redesignated. So where does non-attainment new source review apply? It applies in areas that are non-attainment for that pollutant or for what we refer to as precursor emissions. As an example, for ozone, it's volatile organic compound emissions or nitrogen oxide emissions that cause ozone, and those would be for ozone non-attainment areas, the non-attainment pollutants. We have some areas that violate the standard but are not yet designated non-attainment. Those areas fall under PSD. We have other non-attainment areas that have attained the standard, but it's not a redesignation process in effect yet to have it moved over. And in those cases, we also have to apply non-attainment new source review. So where US EPA has designated the areas of attainment or non-classifiable, that's where the prevention of significant deterioration rules will apply. And it only applies for the attainment pollutants and precursor emissions, as we mentioned in the non-attainment new source review. So it's possible for, in some cases, that we would have a permit that would fall under non-attainment new source review for some pollutants and PSD for other pollutants. Now we have a quick poll. Do you live in a non-attainment area for any pollutant?
Okay, it will take just a few seconds for the poll to show up on your screen, and then we'll allow about 1 minute for responding. Okay, we are now closing the poll. Thank you.
For the most part, it appears as though most people live in attainment areas, which is good. Those are areas that are meeting air quality standards. With that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Thanks, Bob. Let's see if I've got control here. Take just a second. So I'm clicking on there we go. All right. So what I'm going to cover is more detail on prevention of significant deterioration. Good morning, everyone. As Bob mentioned, that's the attainment area stuff. I'm going to go into the goals of the PSD program. Of course, you have to know the terms to understand this, kind of go into applicability, and then some of the requirements of PSD. If it applies to you, what do you have to do? So that's kind of the overall review of PSD. And PSD program is designed to protect the air quality in attainment areas. So it's designed to keep clean air areas clean, but still allow in economic growth. It's designed to protect public health and welfare. And it's also designed to protect, preserve, and enhance air quality in special areas, like some of our national parks. So let's go into the terms. Of course, with rules like these, you have to understand the terms. And we'll start out with the regulated new source review pollutant. And so this is the pollutant that is regulated under this program. It starts out, of course, with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. The constituents or precursors, like Bob mentioned, the particulate matter, the SO2, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, ozone or VOCs, and NOx for ozone, and then lead. And then the next category is if it's regulated under the new source performance standards, which are standards that cover industrial categories, the ozone depleting compounds, which are called Title 6 Class 1 or 2 compounds, and then any other pollutant that is regulated under the Clean Air Act, except for HAPs, which are called hazardous air pollutants. And so those are the general categories that are considered a regulated new source review pollutant, and those are the pollutants that are regulated under the PSD program. The next key term is potential to emit, and it means essentially what the capacity of a piece of equipment is to emit a particular pollutant under its design, physical and operational design. So the way you look at that is you assume that you run the equipment 24 hours a day and calculate the emissions of that piece of equipment to understand what its potential to emit is. Potential to emit can be limited through, this says federally enforceable, but also through state practically enforceable means. For instance, if you have a control device on, or you limit the capacity of the equipment or the hours of operation. You can also have limits on the type of material processed, combusted, or stored, all if it's properly restricted in terms of federal or state practically enforceable. The next one is, next definition is stationary source. And you think of this in terms of a facility or an industrial operation. The stationary source definition has three key factors. The first is all of the emissions units or the equipment that is in the factory belong to the same industrial grouping or are a support facility. So basically, if you have an auto plant with all the equipment associated with the auto plant, that would belong to the same industrial grouping. It has to be located in one or more contiguous or adjacent properties. And then it also has to be under common control. So all three of those things have to be true in order for the facility to be considered one stationary source. And this definition is important when you have two facilities that are next to each other and you're trying to decide whether it's considered one stationary source or two separate stationary sources. There is a different definition for the oil and gas processing because of the uniqueness of that industry. So there's a different definition for that. And then in green in the bottom of this slide, I noted that US EPA has in the last couple of years issued some new guidance on interpretation of this definition concerning contiguous or adjacent, and then also common control. So when you get into the details, you may need to look at that guidance to make sure you understand the situation. All right, the next one is we talked about what a stationary source is. The next layer of that is what is considered a major stationary source. And remember, we're talking about for PSD purposes only. And the PSD rules talk about a major stationary source. There's really two major categories. In the rule, it has a list of 28 source categories. And for instance, steel making is a category listed. If you fit into one of those categories, then you're considered a major stationary source if your facility has greater than 100 tons per year of one of those criteria pollutants. If you don't fit in one of those 28 source categories, then your threshold for being a major stationary source is 250 tons per year. So the key is to look at that list to see if you fit into that list to know which category or which threshold you have to worry about. And then for greenhouse gases, it used to be there was a short time where there would be a threshold specifically for greenhouse gases, but that no longer is true. You would have to trip major stationary source status for one of the other pollutants first before you would end up having to look to see if you were major for greenhouse gases. There are some qualifiers, of course. You look for VOC or NOx for ozone because ozone isn't, it's the precursors are the VOC and NOx for the ozone standard. You don't count quantifiable fugitives unless you're on that list, the 28 source category list. So if you are on that list and you have fugitive emissions, you would count those towards that threshold. But if you're not on that list, then you don't count the fugitives. One of the things about the list is when you look down at that list, it looks very similar to the same things that are regulated under the federal new source performance standards. But you have to know that the list in the PSD rules is general in nature. And you don't just look to see if it's covered by an NSPS, you look to see if your facility is in general that particular category. So that's one thing that mixes people up a little bit. And then the other thing is that if you have a minor facility, but the change that you're contemplating for your facility is by itself over the thresholds, then that project would be considered a major stationary source. So those are kind of different qualifiers for it. And the next key definition is major modification. And this comes into effect when you're making some change to your existing facility and you're trying to decide whether the change qualifies as a major modification. If it does, then PSD applies for that change. It's a long definition, 4-page definition. So that's a lot of stuff. And so there's a lot of things into it, but it really starts out with looking at whether or not there's a physical change or change in the method of operation of your facility or major stationary source. And for that physical change or change in the method of operation, there's a 2-part test. The first part is whether or not the change itself counts as a significant emissions increase of the regulated new source review pollutant. So that's just looking at the individual change. And then the second part is whether or not there's a significant net emissions increase of that pollutant. And I'll go through this in a little more detail next. But both parts have to be true in order for it to trip the definition of major modification. So the first part is looking at the change itself. You're making some change to part of your operation, and if that's over the significance level in terms of increased emissions, then it meets that part. And then the second part is this, what's called the net change, and that also has to be over the significance levels. There are different significance levels for modifications. For instance, we'll go through an example here where for various pollutants, we have like a 40 ton per year threshold. But the bottom line is you have to have both of these things true in order for it to count as a modification. Again, in 2018, the Administrator Pruitt issued a memo that does look at the first step of this guidance and provide some additional or changed guidance on how that is interpreted. So look out for that when you're trying to figure this out. Some other qualifiers for the definition of major modification. You look at the significance levels for VOC, makes it significant for ozone. I think the same would be true for nitrogen oxides. The calculation method for significant emissions increase is different if you're adding a new source as part of this project versus if you are modifying an existing source. So you need to look at the different ways of calculating how you figure out what's significant. And there are different qualifiers for what counts as a physical change or change in the method of operation. And there's also a qualifier for something called a plant-wide applicability limit. And a plant-wide applicability limit is a limit that's established for the entire facility. And it's a little different than other types of limits, so there's a qualifier for it. All right, so what about the applicability for PSD applicability for new facilities? Well, the way you go through this is you determine if the proposed source is and in this case, we're talking about where you have a brand new facility that's going to be installed and you want to know whether PSD applies. You look first to see if the proposed source is a major stationary source for any of the attainment pollutants. That's where you look at the 100 ton or 250 ton threshold. If any of the attainment pollutants trip the major stationary source thresholds, then the source is considered a major stationary source for PSD. So you trip for PSD and you have to get a PSD permit. If you trip for PSD for one of the criteria pollutants, then you also look to see whether or not your greenhouse gases are above the 75,000 ton per year for CO2e or CO2 equivalent emissions. If it is, then you're also have tripped PSD for the greenhouse gases. But if you don't trip for the criteria pollutants, then you don't even look to see whether you would trip for greenhouse gases because you can't trip PSD for greenhouse gases alone. If you have an existing facility and you're modifying that source, then you have to first decide whether or not the existing facility is a major stationary source for any attainment area pollutant. So if you're over the 100 ton or the 250 ton threshold, you would first decide whether your existing facility is considered a major stationary source. Then you look at the physical change or change in the method of operation is occurring, and then you do the two-part emissions increase test for each pollutant. You have to check each regulated new source review pollutant separately, determine if the increase is associated with a modification, qualifies as a significant emissions increase, just like we talked about a bit ago. And then you also determine whether or not the change is a net emissions increase. And it's PSD if the modification is both of those things. Then you look at the greenhouse gas threshold also. Okay, there we go. All right. So here, I think I went through that slide twice. I'm not sure how that happened, but the PSD applicability example that I've got next, we'll look at on the left-hand column, we have an existing facility. It has potential to emit of greater than 251 tons of nitrogen oxides. It has greater than 240 tons of volatile organic compounds. It has 15 tons per year of particulate matter less than 2.5 microns and 50 tons per year of sulfur dioxide. Now, note 1 talks about we're assuming that this facility is located in an attainment area for all of the above pollutants. So that's why PSD would be evaluated. And the fact that it has over 250 tons per year of nitrogen oxides means that emission rate makes it a major stationary source. So it's not a minor stationary source, it counts as a major stationary source. That means that there are these lower thresholds that trigger whether PSD applies for a modification. And so in this case, we have an existing facility and we are saying, well, there's some modification. And if you look at the trigger column, the second to the last on the right, it has the trigger levels for each of the pollutants, 40 tons for NOx, 40 tons for VOC, 10 tons for PM 2.5, and 40 tons for SO2. So in this example, we have a modification. If you look at the second column, there's an increase due to the project of 35 tons of nitrogen oxides and a net increase. And the net increase, you're going to actually look at a 5-year window of other increases and decreases that occurred within the last 5 years. And there were other increases apparently at the time. So the net increase ended up being 45 tons. And the question is, does that trip PSD for nitrogen oxides? And the answer is the trigger level is 40. The net increase is over 40, but the increase for just the project is not over 40. Therefore, both things haven't been true, and it does not trip PSD for NOx. In the next one for VOC, you have an increase of 45 tons for the project itself. But you have a net increase of 35 tons. So apparently within the 5-year window, you had some shutdown sources. And therefore, because the net increase was not over 40 tons, it can't trip PSD. For PM 2.5, we have a 5-ton increase for PM 2.5 for the project. We have a 20-ton increase for the net increase. So there are other increases over the last 5 years. The trigger level is 10 tons per year. Since the increase for the project is less than 10, it doesn't trip PSD. And then finally, for sulfur dioxide, the increase is 45 tons per year for the project itself. The net increase is also 45 tons per year. Both of those are over 40 tons, which is the threshold for sulfur dioxide. And so therefore, this particular project would trip PSD for sulfur dioxide. So the net emissions increase calculation can get pretty complex. So it is important to verify any calculations you have with your district or local air authority or permit writer, and or any consultant that you might have or other person that's knowledgeable in how these things work. It's important to figure that out before you submit the application. Make sure everybody agrees on how the calculation should be done so that you get a good, clean application. to us, and so that we can make sure we process it efficiently. For fugitive emissions for PSD, there are times where you count it, sometimes you don't. And fugitive emissions, it's kind of a strange term, but it basically means emissions that don't come out through a stack or chimney or vent, that kind of thing. And some examples of that for particulate matter or dust or dirt. If you have coal piles and you have dust coming off of those, maybe you have roadways or quarries that have dust that come out of those. Those are considered fugitive emissions because they don't come out of a stack. Same thing for volatile organic compounds. You may have leaky valves or flanges at a refinery and at oil processing equipment. And those would be considered fugitive because they don't come out of a stack. So when you have fugitive emissions, you include them when they are when you're in the 28 source category, the PSD category, or if there happens to be a new source performance standard or national emission standards for hazardous air pollutant standard. Both of those are federal rules that were in effect as of 1980. So you basically look at the list and see whether or not you are in that list, and if so, you're going to be counting your fugitives. And so when that happens, you have to include those emissions to determine whether it's a major modification or major stationary source. And maybe you also have to include it in the air quality analysis and things like that. So fugitives sometimes have to be taken into account and sometimes don't. There's something called secondary emissions, and those are things like emissions that occur during construction, but they're not really from the operation of the source. And so they aren't normally emitted from the source itself. And the best example is construction emissions. They don't count when you're trying to figure out if they're part of what the potential to emit is for the facility. But you may have to include that as part of the analysis if PSD is included. So just a reminder that sometimes you have to look at secondary emissions and provide some support on what those are and how they should be accounted. All right, so if you've gone through all of that and figured out that your project does trip PSD, what do you have to do? And I'm going to go through just one list here. That gives the list. And the first one is you have to employ what's called best available control technology. So essentially, you're trying to put state-of-the-art controls in place on the equipment. You have to do ambient monitoring. For instance, you may have to put in monitors for some pollutants and collect that data for up to a year before you start construction. Often we have monitors that you can use for that information, so you don't end up having to put your own monitors in. But that's an important thing to note, that you may need those monitors ahead of time. You have to do modeling of the emissions, where you have a model that calculates the downwind concentrations of your facility emissions. And verifies that it's going to be protective of public health and other things that needs to meet. There's something called other impact analysis. For instance, maybe your emissions might have some impact on crops or things like that. We don't have time to go through all these in detail, so the bonus material that will be included in your handouts we'll have more details on how each of these works. All right, it's time for another quick poll. And the question is, have you ever applied for a PSD permit?
It will just take a few seconds for the poll to show up on your screen. If you could take a minute and answer it, and then we'll close the poll in about 30 seconds. Okay, we are now closing the poll.
All right, so I see the results for me. It should show up on your screen if it's not there already. That 73% of those who took the poll said they have not had the pleasure, I guess, of applying for a PSD permit. That means that you haven't had the responsibility of either a new project, a brand new project, a large project, or modifying an existing facility, or for an entirely new facility. But we do have some people who have gone through that process. And of course, most of our permits that we process are minor new source review. And that kind of makes sense for what we see as part of the results of PSD of this particular poll. So that's great. Thanks for taking the poll. And then for questions, what we're going to do is try to answer questions at the end. So I think what we're going to do is move on to non-attainment new source review. And we'll be having Bob Hodenbose take it from here at this point.
Thank you, Mike. And we will proceed on discussing what happens in non-attainment areas. What is a regulated pollutant for new source review? It is pollutants associated with the ambient air quality standards, whether it's SO2, ozone, particulate matter, NOx, carbon monoxide, or lead. And as we discussed before, there's very few sources that directly emit ozone, but it's the precursor pollutants that we are concerned with, and that being NOx emissions and VOC for ozone and SO2 and NOx for PM2.5, that those emissions react in the atmosphere for SO2 and NOx and produce fine particulate. This is a little different than for PSD, in that PSD covers some pollutants outside of the NAICS pollutants. So this is strictly for the ambient air quality standard pollutants and doesn't cover as much as PSD. So the applicability is on a parallel path to PSD, but maybe a little bit more clean cut. If a new source is going to emit has the potential to emit over 100 tons per year of one of the criteria pollutants for which the area is designated as a non-attainment, it falls under non-attainment new source review. Or it's a modification that results in a change that has a significant increase. And we have the significance levels tables to show you coming up here. If those emission levels increases are above what's in the table and the source is a major and it's in a designated non-attainment area, then it trips non-attainment new source review. So these are the significant levels. And one of the things that is, again, a little different about non-attainment new source review is that the way US EPA designates, and in this case, it's primarily ozone, but it can also be PM2.5. there are different levels of non-attainment. And in Ohio, all of our areas are designated marginal non-attainment. We may get bumped up to moderate non-attainment in the Cincinnati and Cleveland areas for ozone, but we are not yet close to serious. But as you can see, once the worse the air quality is, the lower the threshold there is to trip major new source review for modifications. So what are the basic fundamental requirements of non-attainment new source review? The first is the source itself, the permit, needs to have in it what's described as lowest achievable emission rate. There has to be emission offsets that provide a reduction in emissions from other sources in the area to offset the new emissions increase. Those emissions offsets have to cause a net air quality benefit in the area. And the entity has to certify that all major operations owned by the source in the state are in compliance with the SIP or on a enforceable schedule for compliance. We'll dive into each of these a little bit deeper. Lowest achievable emission rate. What has to end up on the permit that we issue for a non-attainment new source review application is the layer is described as the most stringent limitation achieved in practice by class or source category. And here is the key: without taking into account economic, energy, or other environmental factors, or the most stringent limitation in a SIP for that source or class of sources. And this can cause, either one of these can cause difficulty in defining what layer is for a major new source. Particularly number two, if you look at some of the standards that are in place in California or along the East Coast, it may make it very difficult to identify what layer is. And for the number one, the most stringent limitation achieved in practice, we in Ohio take the position that that is within the United States. We had one case where we did a very thorough analysis of what is the most stringent limitation achieved in practice and felt we had a good, solid package to show. EPA came in and believed that there were sources in other parts of the world that achieved more stringent limitations, but we ended up continuing on the path that we limited it to sources within the United States. Layer can't be less stringent than any applicable new source performance standards limit, and some of these NSPSs are pretty old, so that's really not that much of an issue. And we need to have it defined for each specific emissions unit that's part of the package. Now, layer can be a combination of things. It can be add-on controls, you can do a process modification, or sometimes a change in the raw material. Again, depending on what other sources have done, this can cause some difficulty in a facility that wants to build, finding what other people have done, because maybe the raw material that they are using, another facility is using, say in Arkansas, is just unique to that particular locality. So that also can be taken into account. The next one is having emission offsets, and a new or modified source is required to offset any emissions increases with a decrease elsewhere in the same non-attainment area. And for ozone, our areas are Cincinnati and Cleveland, and within that map I showed earlier, the emission offsets have to come from the sources that are in that particular area. And it is up to the source to try to find these additional emission increases that go beyond what has been required in previous rules to show that they are going beyond. This is all set up to allow for new source growth in the non-attainment area without making air quality worse than it currently is. Now, how are offsets attained? Typically, there's a purchase from another source. It has to be within the same non-attainment area. There can be some emissions increases from new sources or modifications that have to be obtained from other facilities. The purpose of all this is to help get to attainment while allowing additional industrial growth. In the bonus material, there is additional information on finding emissions offsets. We have also set up an emission offset registry so people can look to see if there's any available in the area. Now, one of the things is what is the how do the offsets work? And there are offset ratios for needing to get 1-to-1 or 1.1-to-1 for areas, whether it's a basic area or non-attainment area. And as it goes up the stair step, and we aren't the serious or severe, those become greater ratios. And again, they should be located in the same non-attainment area. And the offsets must be practically enforceable, and they must be contained in some kind of permit. It can't be, I will use the term, informal arrangement between two entities. So what's not considered an offset? Emission reductions required by the state or a consent decree. There are entities that require, that enter into consent decrees with US EPA to reduce emissions, or we promulgate additional emission reductions as part of our state implementation plan, as we are going to have to do in both the Cincinnati and Cleveland area to show attainment of the ozone standard in the future. We'll have to be adopting additional requirements. Once we adopt those cannot be used as emission offsets. The other thing is the difference between the SIP and the NSPS if it's applicable to the source. Again, that's something of an unusual case. Here's another item that gets a little tricky is the offsets have to produce what's called a net air quality benefit. So the whole idea behind it is that after the source is built, air quality is to be better than before the source began operation. So the offsets itself can come before the source begins operation. They do not have to happen once we issue the permit. They can be a little bit down the road, but not too much. For ozone, it's pretty easy within the non-attainment area, but for SO2 or NOx, that requires some modeling to show that. Finally, there is a requirement to have all major sources owned and operated by the facility in the state to be in compliance with the SIP. This is an item that typically isn't much of an issue, but there have been at times over the years where we've run into a problem that facilities with multiple installations throughout the state have looked at other installations outside the non-attainment area and found that they have been out of compliance. So we've been required to get them on an enforceable schedule. So here we have our last quick poll. Have you ever applied for a non-attainment new source review permit? Yes or no?
Hey, we are starting our last poll. It'll take a few seconds for it to show up on your screen, and then we'll allow about 1 minute for responses. Okay, we are at about 70% of people responding. To those who have not yet responded, go ahead and submit your responses, and then we'll close the poll in just a few moments.
Okay, the poll itself shows 84% have not applied for a non-attainment new source review permit. That is not I will say, a surprising result. We do not process that many non-attainment new source review permits. If we process one a year for the state of Ohio, that would be pretty frequent. So that doesn't happen too often. But again, there are sometimes some expansions need to take place, and the only place it can be done in the non-attainment area. So that is the important factor. Finally, one of the things that most entities use to be able to avoid non-attainment new source review is netting. If there are internal offsets, that is offsets at the plant that can be generated, netting will probably work. If you're adding an additional, a major source, an additional 60 tons of VOC, but you can put on an additional thermal oxidizer and reduce emissions at your existing facility by 70 tons, let's say, then in all likelihood, netting is probably going to work. And that's what is typically used to avoid non-attainment new source review. And the however is it does not work for new facilities because you're getting those reductions from some other plant, and that's what triggers the non-attainment new source review. So the result of all this is the major new source review permitting applies to any kind of new or major modified sources at large facilities. PSD applies to attainment areas. Non-attainment new source review applies to non-attainment areas. We have learned that because of the complexity of the rules, if you know you're going to trip either PSD or non-attainment new source review, it's worthwhile to hire an outside consultant if you haven't dealt with these to assist you in preparing the application. And also, I would say before you even do that, contact your Ohio EPA field office to start the discussions going. They can certainly assist you in terms of outlining what the requirements are to make sure that you're going down at least the proper path, whether it's PSD, non-attainment new source review, or whether even you do trip non-attainment or attain PSD. So work with the field office as soon as you know you're going to have a big project. We have provided a number of different packages for you to look at in terms of rules and all. And with that, we will turn it over for some questions. I'll remind people that the bonus material will go out with the email with all of these slides.
Okay, we have just a few minutes for questions. So I will ask a couple that were sent in. The first is, at what level are permits written at Ohio EPA? The districts, the locals, what level writes the permits?
So I can start with that, the answer on that. And the way it works is we have all these district and local air authorities throughout the state, and they cover certain geographic areas. And the way it works is you send your application in either electronically or directly to one of these facilities. And we have permit writers at those facilities that work with you to develop the permit, do all the review that's necessary, And then once they are done with their part, they send it to central office. For some permits, we do an oversight review for consistency purposes. And then once that's done, we actually issue them out of central office. So you work with the field office, they do the initial work and most of the work, but it does get issued out of central office.
Okay. The next question is, what is the typical length of time to process a PSD application?
So a PSD permit, they vary quite a bit depending upon the flexibility or the complexity of that particular permit. So it's really hard to give you a general time, because usually what we do is when we get an application, we sit down with the applicant and we look at the complexities and what needs to be done, and then set out a schedule to achieve that. But overall, we issue all of our permits. About 95% of our permits are issued within the statutory 180-day time frame. That includes both PSD and non-PSD. But typically for PSD, they take the longer end of that. So for planning purposes, at least 6 months. But really the best thing to do is to talk to us up front and get a good schedule so that we know how long it's going to take for everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Let me add that as part of the complexity, depending on the relocation of the source, the facility that's getting the PSD permit, if there are surrounding sources that must be modeled as part of the permit, that adds both time and complexity. Or if it's an isolated source, that can make it go quick.
Yeah, and certainly the other thing that takes time is preparing the application. So when you're doing that, it may take you quite a bit of time to put the application together. We can work with you on that to try to help that process. But typically you're going to use a consultant to do all the work that needs to be done just to put the application together.
Okay, thanks. And one last question is, how can I access Ohio EPA's emission offset registry to see if any offsets are available?
Yeah, it's actually on our webpage. And I think probably the best thing to do is to we'll provide the link and send it out to parties. So if you go on into the Division of Air Pollution Control and look in the programs area, I think it is, you can find a link to it. And it has a database that has all of those, the ones that have been submitted that are available for offsets.
Thank you. I think that's all the time we have. Just a few minutes over for our session. We will follow up with anyone who submitted a question that we have not answered in writing during the session or during the question answer. I would like to thank Bob and Mike and thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Air Permitting for Major Sources Part 2 is coming up this afternoon at 2 o'clock. And you still have time to register for that session if you'd like. If you have any other questions, feel free to contact our staff at any time or email them to Mike or Bob. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you could complete the survey because we'd really like to have your feedback. You would also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar, a certificate of attendance, and another link to a survey if you haven't had a chance to complete it now. So I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we hope you're able to participate in more of Ohio EPA's virtual Compliance Assistance Conference. Thank you for attending, and have a great day.